Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast.
Fill finish capacity has become a major constraint for pharma and biotech companies, particularly those developing combination products. While CDMOs have traditionally focused on filling syringes, many are increasingly taking on final assembly of devices and coordinating primary container supply. That shift is changing what companies need to look for in a fill finish partner and how those relationships work. Stephen Kaufman has spent over 20 years in the drug delivery device space, holding executive roles at SHL Medical, Bestback, and Stevanato Group before moving into consulting. He now works as Chief Commercial Officer for Portal Instruments and Chief Strategy Officer for EcoInject, while advising biotech companies, private equity firms, and CDMOs on fill finish selection, final assembly strategy, and device partnerships. His work sits at the intersection of device development and CDMO operations, helping companies navigate which fill-finish partners can handle the complexity of bringing auto-injectors, pen injectors, and on-body delivery systems to market. In this episode, we'll talk about why fill-finish capacity disappeared so quickly, how device companies and CDMOs actually coordinate on final assembly, and what biotech companies get wrong when selecting fill-finish partners for combination products. Stephen, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Dora. It's great to be here today and have the chance to do this podcast with you.
So let's start with you then. Can you just walk us through your background and what your consulting work focuses on?
Sure, I'll do my best. I think a lot of people that know me in the industry recognize some of the companies that I had the chance to work with, as you mentioned in the past. I got my start actually thanks to Roger Samuelson, the founder of SHL Medical, and had the chance to work with great people like Ulrich Fessler, the CEO, and build my career starting in marketing and then in business development. And it gave me a lot of exposure to biotech, especially large pharma, and also gave me some exposure to primary container. I did that while I was based in Taiwan. I was there for about 20 years. And then I spent some time over where you are in the UK, supporting Bestpack as their global lead for injectables. And of course, the opportunity to work with the Stevanato Group and to build up drug delivery systems for them, contract manufacturing, as well as proprietary device. And I think living in Italy as well, I got far more exposure to fill finish companies. And that's when I first started to discover how many more services these important CMOs were offering to pharma and biotech. And I think that's part of the reason we're talking today, to understand a little bit more how they are supporting the whole value chain and continuing to grow those services as they offer them to the clients I mentioned before.
You work with both the device companies and pharma and biotech, sort of a space I don't really see many people in. How does that both side perspective shape how you think about fill-finish partnerships?
It gives me a greater respect for the complexity of taking a combination product to market. So in the past, as someone who's more recognized as a device person, I often look at it through that lens. But when I started to do the consulting a couple of years ago, and I had the chance to work with a small, mid-sized biotech company to help them to select their contract manufacturer, their prefilled syringe, and work towards selecting a good auto-injector, I suddenly realized how hard it is for companies that perhaps only have one or two people in their team to actually take a combination product to market. And I also realized that having good relationships with senior executives in some of these companies can really be an asset for you to be able to get access to information that you need to help these companies make the decision. So when I was working with a biotech company, I was fortunate to be able to call a CEO or a senior executive in some of these companies so that we could get immediate access. And some other companies have told me it's quite difficult to get the information they need to make their selection. But, these are great companies. I think the companies I mentioned before, they all offer great services, but you have to plan things years in advance, and you have to be able to find that slot, not only for your clinical stability batches, but also for your commercial, and anticipate what the costs are for that as well. And if you're a smaller company, sometimes those costs can be quite prohibitive. And it's become quite challenging, as I said before, to get that that interaction, get that space locked up, and then be able to move on.
Absolutely. Could you quickly clarify what you mean by combination product and just give me a little bit of information about sort of the complexity and logistics of the manufacturing chain there?
Sure. So for me, combination product is defined in a few ways. When I say combination product, I'm usually referring to something that is a device. So auto injectors such as the one I have here, two-step, 1 ml, 2.25, and it has a pre-filled syringe. Now, the pre-filled syringe in itself is considered a combination product. But to me, it's like the whole value chain. So moving from, say, you have a drug product that's available in vial, or you've decided to go straight into pre-filled syringe, that's when it becomes a combination product. And then covering my area, when it's also attached to an auto injector or a pen injector or an on-body delivery system using a cartridge or a vial, that's what I define as a combination product. But the FDA have their guidelines and the other regulatory authorities as well. But most people, when they hear the word combination product, they think device with primary container with an injectable product.
I was actually having a conversation just yesterday about partnerships and terminology, and that actually often there's slightly different definitions for all this jargon in the industry. So getting that right is actually quite complicated.
Challenge for me too. I mean, not to interrupt you, but when you say CMO, sometimes I think of contract manufacturing companies that are doing the device for pharma. And other people, when they say CMO, what they're referring to is the fill finish companies. So I often have to define it as well. But I mean, the exciting thing for us, Dora, in the industry is that it's become more understood. I mean, when I started 21 years ago in the device space and I told people what I was doing, they wouldn't really understand until I said something like an EpiPen. And, over the years, I've worked on inhalers, pen injectors, auto injectors, on-body delivery systems, safety systems. But now if you go down, especially to the US where they have advertising, I think you can't sit and watch a TV for more than 10 minutes without seeing an ad that does talk about a new injectable product that's going to be helping people to have better lives and perhaps be able to take their injections at home rather than having to go to the hospital. So it's great to see the awareness. Unfortunately, with some geopolitical challenges as well as things such as the pandemic, we've seen that planning and working with the right partners is vital to getting your combination product to market today.
And I guess that brings us on actually to talk about fill finish capacity. It's famously tight right now. What would you say is driving that?
Well, I think a lot of people are going to just automatically say GLP-1s
Yeah.
and the big push from the larger companies that are well known in the industry, whether it's the Novos or the Lillys of the world. But there are a lot of other great companies, Viking, Amgen, AstraZeneca, many others, Roche, that are getting into the GLP-1 space. So I think that's probably the first thing that most people start to think of when they talk about capacity. I think the other aspect is the fact that although there are good choices, a lot of great companies that are doing fill finish, it's not that these companies have been able to build up a lot of excess capacity. So even before the GLPs, it was difficult to get capacity at some of these sites. They've tried to scale up. They've made acquisitions, which is terrific. Great companies like PCI, for example, have gotten more and more into fill finish and having certain capabilities. But what we observe now is that we sometimes forget there are still so many other injectable drug products that are coming to market. And because these products are also competing for the same space, then you have a decision. And I spoke with a CEO of one of the fill finish companies recently trying to help get some additional space for one of my clients. And he had told me that they specifically were not generally working with large volume, large quantity GLP-1s because they didn't want to tie up all their capacity. So I think that there are different companies using different strategies. Of course, many of them are very attracted to those high volumes, high quantities, but I think later on we're going to talk a little bit about the uncertainty of what's going to happen with GLP-1s, with oral medications now coming into the market. And also some talk about, how you can be competitive when the market's quite dominated by a couple of key players.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get into that, on this fill finish capacity, would you say this sort of crunch is global, or are there specific regions where it's worse?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I don't know if I can give the answer that's going to be perfect, but I would say that typically in Europe and the US, it's a bit harder to get capacity. And some companies are now looking at the APAC region, China, for example. There's some great companies that have grown incredibly over the last few years. And I think that's because they were able to offer capacity. But I would say globally, there is a bit of a challenge right now to get this space. So you really have to plan a couple of years ahead, and you really have to work out those contracts so that you can be sure what you're going to get when you move to commercial and ensure that you have the right capacity. Some companies are going to work with a partner or a supplier just for their early stage, for their development work, maybe their prefilled syringe selection, and then perhaps for their early clinical. But then what they might be doing later on is moving to a more established player once they have higher quantities and more committed volumes, and when they know that their drug product is actually going to make it to market. One thing that most people don't understand is one of the reasons for the higher cost of the medications is the fact that you can take it up through the different phases, but there's still no guarantee that that product will ever make it to market. And that's a lot of investment up front and a lot of commitment by these companies. It's also a risk for fill finish and CMO companies because they're betting you are going to go to market and you've got that slot. So it's a bit of a balancing act.
When a biotech comes to you looking for a fill finish partner for a combination product, what is the first thing you'd assess?
Cultural fit. I think you and I talked
Mm.
about it about a month ago, and to me, especially if it's a smaller or mid-sized company, is trying to find a partner that is regionally close for them. So regionally close, they benefit from the time zone. I know that sounds very basic, but being in a time zone situation where it's 1 or 2 hours difference is far better than 12 hours or 6 hours, especially if you're a North American company. Culturally, because if you're based in North America, you can work with a CMO that's here in the region. I think there's a great benefit because if there are things you need to check, site reviews, supply chain check, or decision points or executive engagement, I think that you can be there, within a day or within half a day. I think that's very beneficial. One of the things I just mentioned that I think is vital is some sort of executive engagement. So having a senior person within the company that could help advocate for you, that's one of the things that I try to do with my biotech clients. I mostly work with device companies, but when I work with the biotech clients, I try to ensure that they have an executive sponsor or an executive contact. And I find that makes it a lot smoother for those companies to get quicker responses and to be able to go down, do the site review, get the quotes, review the quotes, and make sure that you can meet the timelines that your executive have set for you as well.
Yeah. So what does cultural fit actually mean to you, maybe beyond geographic proximity?
Yeah, cultural fit can be interpreted in many ways. For me, it's the companies are going to get along, that they're going to be able to work through challenges and problems because every time you're bringing a combination product to market, there are always challenges that you're going to have to face. One could be making sure that you have the right prefilled syringe with the mechanical tolerances for the auto injector you select. Another could be making sure you have the right needle gauge to ensure that you have the right injection time. And there are always things that you discover during the process. And so for me, cultural fit means that I can feel comfortable talking with this partner and that they can work well with us. And it's not transactional. I think that we work in a great industry. And I believe that most of the companies I mentioned are wonderful companies to work with. But having those companies based in the region you're going to launch is really beneficial, or where your team is at, so that you can develop that long-term relationship. If I'm working with a partner, I'd like them to work with a supplier that they can use for multiple drug products So if they chose a BD or a Stevanato or a shot for the prefilled syringe, I would hope they would continue that relationship. The same with the device company, if it's an SHL or an Ipsomed or one of the other suppliers of auto injector that I work with, like EcoInject or Portal. You want to be able to develop that relationship so there's a reoccurring business, and hopefully they can use the same, primary containers, the same device suppliers, and the same goes with the fill finish companies. To be honest, it takes 6 months to a year to build that rapport, and you want to be able to leverage that rapport and make sure that they're going to have capacity for you and that you have a good team of professionals that are able there to help you. And that's one of the challenges in the industry. People are now taking device people to go to the fill finish companies, and device companies are taking fill finish people to go to the device company. And the same with the pharma companies, they're pulling from everyone. So people are a really valuable resource. And having that person that you can talk to as your key point of contact is quite, I think, quite beneficial, especially for those small, mid-sized companies.
Yeah, for sure. So tell me, how has fill finish CDMO's role evolved beyond just filling syringes?
Yeah, so I think the key thing I learned, like I had said before when I was working at Stevanato, is that some of the companies, small, mid-sized, and even larger companies, would like the fill finish to help them to control more of the value chain. So with that, there's a few things. So I'll break it down. One, let's go pre-filled syringe. So they want you to be able to handle the pre-filled syringe as well as the plunger and the RNS, and to be able to order those quantities and have those quantities available at the site where you're going to be doing your filling. Two, they don't necessarily help you with the selection of your auto injector, but once you've selected your auto injector, they certainly can help to do the final assembly. So in the past, what companies would have to do is they would pay for equipment from ATS or from Micron or Harrow Hoflinger or Stevanato, EMA. These companies, they'd set up that equipment and they'd have a dedicated line that's only for their device. So typically one device, one machine. And that cost was usually covered by the big pharma or the pharma or device, collaboration there was covered by them. Now we see the CMO companies being more strategic and the equipment manufacturers being a bit more creative. So we see equipment that's now designed to handle some of the more common auto injectors on the market, which would be Moly, Ipsomate for sure, perhaps BD or Mumford, and some others that are trying to get in there. And so that really helps if I can go to a fill finish company and they have that ability to source and manage my pre-filled syringe for me, and they already have installed equipment that perhaps can help me not only with my clinical but also with my commercial. And I believe that that's one of the biggest aspects of doing that final assembly and managing that end to end. Now, some pharma, they don't need that. Some pharma, they will do the final assembly completely by themselves at one of their sites, and certainly that helps them with the cost. But other pharma and biotech companies don't have the capability or believe it's better to leave that with the CMO. So that sourcing of the primary container and managing of that relationship for them, helping to get the sub-assemblies for the auto injector from the device company where it's manufactured, and then ensuring that they have final assembly equipment on site that can do the final assembly for the pharma company and then the potentially packaging and serialization.
So what does that final assembly actually look like? Why do some CDMOs invest in that capability while others don't?
I think a lot of them do now. I think in the past it was more of something that was asked by the companies and they did it begrudgingly because floor space is always at a premium. When you set up those sites, you want to make sure that you're not only utilizing the floor space properly, but you've got that equipment running at the highest OEE possible, and then you're getting the output and the payback for that investment. I would say that most of the fill finish companies now are required to have final assembly capabilities. And I think most are being driven to these types of machines that have high throughput, can deal with multiple devices and have change parts. And I believe that that can be very lucrative for the CMO companies as a not only a value add, but a must have as part of the supply chain. So it's that primary container, the standard fill finish, the managing of the sub-assemblies and the final assembly with the equipment. And then they have release testing and then, of course, shipping it to where the pharma or the biotech company. I'm making it incredibly simplistic. To be honest, it's incredibly complex, but it's not that the CMOs are going to make a ton of money from helping to source and manage the pre-filled syringes, but I believe that final assembly of device can be very profitable and also it's added responsibility. So that's important as well. They need to be rewarded for that.
Let's switch gears a little bit back to the capacity conversation. If you're a smaller biotech, maybe with a rare disease indication, with small batch requirements, how would you compete for fill finish slots when, GLPs are sucking up capacity?
I think honestly, if you have the money, you can get the spot. At the end of the day, it's if you're willing to pay for it, you'll be able to get your batches taken care of. The secret is no surprise. It's looking at the partners, looking for that cultural fit, trying to get some sort of engagement at a senior level, and then understanding that you have to do it early. So what I tell the clients that I work with is the sooner you can go to the sites and to visit the people, the better. And the quicker you can reserve your capacity. So I worked with one client recently and they really loved one of the contract manufacturing companies, but they weren't able to get capacity. And so they went with another one. Everything seemed perfect. They were going through the process. And while they were working through the process to actually lock in that slot, they were told that it was already gone. So I'd say engage early, find that cultural fit, and then pay the money to reserve the slot and sign the agreement and lock it in. That will be at risk for some of these biotech companies and the smaller ones in particular because they don't know if the drug product will continue to make through. They don't always know if the business case will finally get approved by the executive. But I'd say engage early, look for that cultural fit, and then lock in with a contract as quickly as possible so you don't lose that capacity. And same thing with final assembly. If you're going to require some final assembly for your clinical, make sure that that company, if you're going to do the fill finish there, if they are your chosen partner also for your final assembly, lock that in, get the pricing, and commit to it as quickly as possible.
Along a similar vein, then, what is the most common mistake biotechs making when selecting a fill finish partner?
I think one of the most common mistakes is only looking at one or two of the biggest players and not looking at some of the other growing fill finish companies that'll perhaps be a bit more hungry for the business. I have nothing against the biggest players. I mean, the Vetters of the world, Thermo Fisher, now PCI and others, they're fantastic companies and they will always try to accommodate you. But I'd say cast the net a bit wider to be able to have a look at some of the smaller or the mid-sized specialty fill finish companies and see if that would be a better fit for you. So the second mistake is what I referred to before is when you go to the sites and you identify a partner that you want to work with, Dora, I think that companies need to be willing and ready with their executive to pull the trigger and to make that decision and move forward. So I would say not casting the net a bit wider, not selecting quick enough and not signing agreements or commitments soon enough because that competition, even with the oral GLP-1s, with all the new injectables, I think we'll continue to see long times for setting up, batches and especially for the smaller batches, smaller companies that perhaps don't have the global reach.
How much would you agree with the idea that sponsors should find CDMOs and partner with the ones that are the same size as them? So small sponsors partnering with small CDMOs, big players partnering with big players.
Oddly, I don't necessarily agree. I
Mm.
would say that some of the larger companies, if you have the right relationship and the right access and a site that's a good fit regionally or geographically for you, I see no issue with that. There is a school of thought, Dora, that says exactly what you said. If I'm a smaller mid-sized company, it's better for me to look for a smaller mid-sized CMO. But I think it's going back to what I said before. Can you build that relationship? Do you understand how they work and if that's going to work well with you? I mean, there are some great companies, Grand River, Incog, others that are growing and they're providing incredible services. And I think they're going to continue to expand. What I hope we see, though, is more options for companies, greater access. So I like what PCI has done. I like what other companies are starting to do to provide more services, but it takes time. The pharma industry, the biotech industry is very conservative. So most people are typically drawn to the most established names and the companies that they know extremely well, or perhaps they have a previous relationship with them because they used to work with them when they were in another biotech or pharma company. And I like that strategy. I think if you've worked with someone before, you feel comfortable with them, and then now you've changed companies, it's easy to go back and work with the same companies again. You have that rapport and that relationship from the prior engagement.
You also advise private equity on device and tooling company investments. What are they looking for right now?
That's a lot of fun. I think that they're looking for value and they're looking for either roll-ups or add-ons, or they're looking to buy into companies and to help them to restructure and to be more profitable. And I've really enjoyed over the last 2 years having the opportunity to work with several private equity companies and also help raise some funds for companies I work for now that are device companies. So they're looking for value. They're looking for companies that can be perhaps combined with others. I've seen that with tooling, with contract manufacturers of device. I've also seen that companies are looking to get into that space. We see some of the biggest players in the CMO of device space that are owned by private equity, and they see this industry as very hot. I have noticed in the last 6 months there is some concern again about the GLP-1s moving to oral and whether or not devices will be as much in demand, which would have a knock-on effect on tooling, a knock-on effect on contract manufacturing, and the fill finish area that you're so involved with. But, we can talk about that a little bit later. I'd say the market's robust. I'd say the market's continuing to look for opportunities to combine the smaller mid-sized companies to make them bigger players and make them more strategic. And I would say our industry, Dora, is incredibly hot right now.
How do you keep your finger on the pulse in this industry to understand what's going on enough that you'd feel comfortable advising investors?
I think I've been very lucky to work at a company like SHL for 10 years and to work with so many great players. So I got access to all the tool makers, all the equipment makers, and got a pretty good insight into what the fill finish companies were doing. Same with Bestpak, Stevanato with Primary Container. And so it's just experience with programs. So I've worked with programs that are, 100,000 devices to 100 million devices. And with that experience, you develop a rapport with the fill finish companies and also the tooling makers, contract manufacturing companies. It seems like it's a big industry, but in many ways, I think it's quite small. And one way I keep my finger on the pulse is by staying active with, different exhibitions, speaking, being on panels, working with PDA, PODD, CPHI, and then continuing to stay connected with my network and having the chance to do this podcast with people like yourself is another way to stay relevant. It's always good to meet new people like you and to also try to understand what challenges people are facing with their combination product or with their fill finish providers.
Yeah, it does seem in this industry, everyone really understands the importance of communication and network. So as you were mentioning earlier, there's a lot of talk about oral GLP-1s replacing injectables. Do you think that will meaningfully ease fill finish capacity pressure?
I think it might help a bit. It depends on what the number is. So we now see everyone talking about Novo Nordisk, and you had comments from Goldman Sachs. I think they were 20% of GLP sales by 2030. And I believe you had a senior executive at Novo Nordisk saying it could be as high as 30% of their sales by 2030. But for me, I don't think it really appreciates or covers the entire market. So you just have, the first oral and the second will be coming soon, but then you have so many other GLPs that are not going to be easily produced in the oral form. And what people don't often understand is when you look at again, I'm going to say a few things. I want to make sure I say it right. The overall cost, the amount of API to actually make these oral medications, in some cases could be even more expensive than it is to have the injectable with the device in the primary container. Or at the very least, there's going to be complexity in making them. And there's also some data that needs to be shown in terms of the overall long-term efficacy and what that looks like. So I'm a bit of a outlier. Most people are saying it's going to have a significant impact on contract manufacturing and the fill finish companies and the primary container companies. I'm not sure it will. I believe that it will have an impact, may free up some capacity, but with the other injectables that are coming to market, also we have the patent expirations that are coming in 2030, 2032, 2035. I think we're going to see other players getting into the market as well, and they're going to take some capacity. They're also going to order devices, primary containers. So I'd say it's too early to say what the real impact will be. The market right now reacts very quickly to everything without necessarily having the long-term data. I'd say once we get more data from Lilly on the market, more data from Novo on the market, and then we see what other orals may be coming in the near future, that might give us more clarity. But with a lot of the new GLPs or similar products that are going to help with lifestyle like weight loss, I don't think they'll be in oral form. I think they'll still be in injectables. So my view is the industry is strong. It will continue to grow. Will it have an impact? Yes, but I don't believe it'll be overly significant for now. But that's just my personal opinion, as is everything I'm saying today.
Of course. If that's the case in a few years, then we have you on record. And you said it first. You also mentioned how in this industry, there's a lot of talk, maybe things can be overhyped. How do you separate what might just be industry hype from something that actually has real long-term value?
I guess it depends on the topic. So the hot one right now we just referred to is the orals. I believe that people are also trying to assess whether or not the injectable industry in itself can continue to grow and be so successful. I mean, you build up a new site, you fill it within a couple of years, and then you have to keep building. And how can these companies that are providing services to these industries, whether it's primary container, equipment for subassembly, final assembly, tool makers, how can it continue to grow at this pace? I talk to other experts. I mean, I often speak to great people like Bill Rich, Legacy Amgen, or Jim Collins, who used to be at Sanofi and Lilly, and other consultants that I know. And I stay in touch with them. I say, what have you heard about this? And what are your thoughts? So I do things in an unofficial way and just talk to some of the best contacts I know that have been in the industry for 20, 30 years. I also do a lot of research. I think it's important to research and look at trends in the market and talking to different kinds of experts. So if I'm more of a device person, perhaps I spend more time talking to primary container or other tool makers and what they're seeing. But I think there is still a bit of a COVID hangover. You're probably not going to hear many people even mention the word COVID, but it wasn't that long ago. I think that really showed our weakness in our supply chain. So companies now more than ever are going to have that regional approach, and they're going to have to ensure that if they're really great in Europe, perhaps they beef things up in the US, and then eventually from the US and Canada, they've got to beef things up in the APAC region so that they can provide that full service approach. I still think people underestimate geopolitical challenges. So when we look at some of the ongoing wars, the impact on that, not only on prices like oil, but also our ability to source certain materials. In the last 21 years, I've seen a number of pandemic-like incidents and natural disasters. And I think disaster planning as well as supply chain mitigation is really important. So making sure as a larger company, you have a really good understanding of your supply chain and you reduce risk. And, unfortunately, there's also the economic side. It's the inflation, the higher cost of shipping, the higher cost of getting products, from Europe to the US. And in recent year or so, we've also seen tariffs and also trade agreements come into play. When I was helping one of the biotech clients that I was working with recently, we were looking at device selection, and one of the considerations was, would there be tariffs in place at the time that we're going to purchase? Same with equipment and same with other things. So I think now there's a bit more complexity and uncertainty. So getting the right partners, getting them early, signing those deals, the collaboration, build that rapport, executive engagement, and you should be good.
If, say, oil prices remain high a bit more long term, how do you see that impacting this industry? May it potentially have an impact on patients?
It really depends. So when I look at certain commodities like oil, they are sometimes utilized in materials that are used to make the devices. So when you look at raw materials and those materials being utilized to make the sub-assemblies, which are later put together to be the final and finished device, certain things like that can really impact the pricing. And there's also going to be a bit of scarcity as well. So I don't believe the near term is going to have a great impact on what we're doing. But if we see like the conflict in Ukraine, there is a long sustained conflict in other regions, I think that will have an impact, either inflationary or on the raw materials that are being utilized to make certain elements of the product. If shipping becomes more complex and more expensive, that cost gets added on, and ultimately all of that goes back to the patient. Typically they're going to have to charge a higher fee for the combination product to recoup some of their costs, or they're going to squeeze their suppliers and push the suppliers to take perhaps a lower level of profitability. But I mean, the things that concern me most are the security of the supply chain, some of that uncertainty, geopolitical, and trying to make sure we manage economic topics like inflation, recession, and so on. And it's a very delicate balance. If you hear all of this, some people might ask, well, why would you want to go into combination products? Well, I think pharma biotech are just looking to find the right solution for their patients that gives them the greatest efficacy and return value to their shareholders by making a profitable product that can long-term serve the needs of the patient and help those big biotech pharma companies continue to grow.
How can you advise biotechs and investors in such uncertain and volatile times?
Stay the course. I mean, for me, I think that most things tend to work out eventually. COVID was a really unusual time. One day I was living in Italy, and the next day I'm being told to work from home, and I didn't know how I was going to manage, having a camera on my computer and being on video all the time, having the right microphone. You just find a way to manage it. And so I would say that for a lot of the companies that are new to combination products, the first is education. Go to some of the conferences, meet some of the key suppliers and the partners. Ideally, hire a consultant. I'm not saying me. I'm actually pretty full with time right now, but there are some great consultants in the industry. and hiring one of them to do a workshop or a training session and giving you that background of best practices, key learnings, things to avoid, things to do, I think it'll help a lot. But yeah, to me, I'm still very positive on the industry overall, despite some of the challenges we've faced. And I think that most of those will be worked through. What we do have to ensure, though, is you have the right partners. And that takes time. You build a rapport, establish those long-term partnerships, and then you try to stick with those partners and continue to utilize them as you get other injectable products. So you go from that first product that's maybe a 1 ml to a 2.25, or you're using cartridge products with great devices like on-body devices like Gerresheimer, LTS. There's still a lot of talk about those, but with GLPs, everyone usually talks about auto injectors and pen injectors, to be honest.
Yeah. Finally, then, as a closing note, where do you see the biggest gaps or inefficiencies in how the industry handles combination product manufacturing?
I would probably say, most people would say capacity, but I think to me it's probably people. So when I got started a little later in my career than I expected in device space 21 years ago, I'm now 57. I I started to see 4 or 5 years ago some of the best people in the industry I knew retiring. So what I'm continuing to see over the last couple of years and even this year is that there are a lot of terrific people who've been in the industry for many, many years are now moving to consultancy or they're retiring altogether. So the biggest challenge I see in the industry right now is having people that have the experience, that have worked with multiple projects, have lived through the challenges, and have been able to anticipate. I think that's one of the big gaps. Capacity and lead time, price, you could talk about all of those. But I would say it's making sure that the incredibly talented people we have now, especially people that are in their 20s, their 30s, their early 40s, that they get the right level of support, right level of experience and training, and we grow those people. Keeping people is also a really key aspect of it, rewarding them and ensuring that they can grow their careers within their companies. And some of the big CMO fill finish companies you talk about, one of the things I respect about them so much is that they've kept people in some cases for decades. So if they continue to grow that talent and maintain that talent, they'll continue to be incredibly successful.
Great. Stephen, thanks a lot for taking the time out of your day to share your thoughts with me. It's been great.
Well, thank you so much, Dora. It's been terrific to have the chance to talk with you.